simplifications, so whereby hauliers can drop in and ask advice. Moving forward with that, there's going to be further support for them in terms of access to Wi-Fi and printers so that they can obtain data while they're on the move. And so there's a lot of developments underway in terms of that. The check-in HGV is ready to cross the border. That was previously referred to in July as the smart freight system. Essentially, there's another step put into the process where every HGV that crosses the border is going to be required to log certain information about the goods that they're carrying and about the truck itself. And based on the information that's entered, that system, that web-based system, will prompt them to make sure that they've got the right documentation, which is really important because whilst it's the trader that's typically responsible, depending on what capacity their agent is working for them, but typically it's the trader that's responsible for supplying the right documentation to clear goods. But in reality, sometimes that doesn't happen, and it's actually the truck driver or the haulier that gets to the border and either is held up because the documentation isn't correct or is turned away. And obviously, when we're dealing with quite a precious situation as we are at the moment, where we're expecting some delays already, then we can't afford for that to happen. So we're putting a step in the process that kind of prompts hauliers to make sure that they've got the right documentation to prevent those delays and turning back. Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act. So if you look in the UK trade tariff, you will see that there are a number of sanctions and trade embargoes, and there are some countries that we can't receive goods from and we can't send goods to. Really, in terms of the turn of the year, this is really quite good news. Essentially, we are grandfathering over existing EU sanction regimes. So from our perspective, as traders, there's not really that much changes, which is good, but I just thought I'd highlight it anyway because we have clarity in terms of that's how they're going to do this now. Where the border operating model stops and starts, so it doesn't include clearance for operating model for Wales and Scotland, which I'm imagining there's nobody on this call that is in those territories. But that's been managed with the devolved administrations, and the government's working closely with those. It also doesn't cover the flow of GB in Northern Ireland goods. As you'll remember, last week I talked about the Northern Ireland Protocol. Means that effectively we refer to GB as kind of independent to Northern Ireland in many ways, although they're still part of the UK Customs Union. So if there's any of you that are impacted by flow of goods between GB and Northern Ireland, then there are separate guidelines that I've provided the link for here. And there's also the Trader Support Service, which I would recommend you sign up to. That is a service specifically around that GB Northern Ireland flow of goods. So there's lots of support there, so sign up to that. Okay, now we're going to look at the border operating model in terms of imported goods. And there's a lot on this slide. I struggled with how much do I put on? Do I just point you in the direction of the border operating model, or do I put the salient points down? So I settled for the latter. So remember I referred to kind of non-controlled or standard goods and then controlled goods. So if we look at standard goods first, so like I said, anything from electronics to clothing, that kind of thing. As an importer, you'll be able to make a full declaration at the point of import, so when the goods arrive into Great Britain, or if you're authorised for a simplified declaration, then you can make a simplified declaration. But that would mean that you are paying the import duty and import VAT once those goods arrived in the UK or in GB. Part of the phasing in model allows traders of standard goods to delay their declarations. So what that means is that they can simply, and I alluded to this last week as well, they can make an entry in their own commercial records. And I've put a box just at the right-hand screen to show the kind of data that you need to keep in your commercial records. But you can make that entry in your own records, account for import VAT and import duty, but not actually have to declare that import to HMRC until the 1st of July. So that's where you'd make a supplementary declaration. So in order to do that, you're going to need a duty deferment account, which typically has a customs comprehensive guarantee or a CCG. Now, the new rules that have just been released are actually removing the requirement of a CCG, providing the customs liability or the debt against the duty deferment account doesn't exceed £10,000 per month. So result for businesses that have been put off from applying for a duty deferment account in the past because they've had to have that guarantee from the bank, which can be lengthy and difficult to obtain. So you can apply for a duty deferment account now without a guarantee, so long as your liability doesn't go over that £10,000 a month. You can't defer your declarations if you want to make a simplified frontier declaration. And it's not applicable for non-union status goods, so those that are not intended for free circulation in GB. So that would be if you were importing for a different kind of simplified procedure, you wouldn't be able to defer that declaration. And the other thing that that HMRC want to ensure is that traders are solvent and have a good compliance history. If you don't have that, then you won't be able to apply for a duty deferment account, and as a result, you won't be able to defer your declarations. Groupage loads I'll touch on very briefly. Obviously, some traders receive their goods in groupage loads. I suppose the onus is greater on those combined traders to make sure that their goods have all of the documentation in order to clear, because a groupage load will be held up if one consignment within that groupage load is held up for whatever reason. It holds up the whole groupage load. So, now that we're dealing with declarations and documentation, it becomes even more important to make sure that you've got everything in place that you need to. Now, in terms of import VAT for standard goods, so if you are making a full declaration, or you're making a simplified declaration, but in essence you're paying the import duty and VAT when the goods arrive in the UK, then you can use postponed VAT accounting if you want to, but there's no requirement on you to do that. And non-VAT registers can use their duty deferment account. They can settle up with HMRC for their VAT as the goods are cleared, or if they have a duty deferment account, they can defer both their import duty and VAT against that deferment account if they're not VAT registered. However, if you've decided to delay your declaration, so if you decided to, just make that entry in declarant's record and settle up with HMRC towards July when you submit that supplementary declaration, then you must use postponed VAT accounting for your import VAT. So you would be using your duty deferment account for your import duty, but you'd be using your postponed VAT accounting for the import VAT. That's mandatory if you're deferring those declarations. Non-VAT registered companies can again use their duty deferment account. Okay, there's a change to consignments below £135, so import VAT is no longer required at the border, but they've removed that low value consignment relief. And what that means is that the trader, so you've brought in the goods, you don't pay import VAT on them, but then VAT is applied at point of sale and accounted for in your quarterly VAT return. So it's a slight change there, but it could potentially speed up the clearance of goods for those smaller consignments. Now, in terms of controlled goods, so we talked about what they were a moment ago, they have to make a full declaration when those goods come into GB, or they can make a simplified customs declaration if they are authorised. So that entry in declarant's record that I referred to before, or the simplified declaration procedure, but they're authorisations that you have to obtain from HMRC in advance. If they are VAT registered, again, they can use postponed VAT accounting, and non-VAT registered businesses can use their duty deferment account. So controlled goods require import declarations from the 1st of January, and standard goods, you can make those declarations from the 1st of January, or you can defer them for 6 months. Okay, there's a lot on here. And you'll get the slides after this. I'm just going to pick out some salient points really. So as I said, the border operating model splits goods down into standard, controlled, and then these goods that have additional requirements placed upon them. So I mentioned endangered species of wild fauna and flora earlier needing a site certificate. So what I've provided here is the goods that are impacted. So the first column is those goods covered by international conventions and commitments. So there are a host of goods there, and I've also provided the measures that need to be taken from the 1st of January on these goods when they're imported. So a lot of the kind of measures from the 1st of January involve registration and pre-authorization, and sometimes pre-notifications and pre-authorizations for the imports of those goods. But there is no requirement for say export health certificates in every single situation. Live animals and germinal products, as we say, will need to be accompanied by an export health certificate. So I showed you the system earlier for where you would apply for that. There'll need to be a pre-notification submitted by the importer to the IPAF system. That replaces the EU Traces system, which you may or may not be familiar with, but that's the UK equivalent. And that pre-notification will have to be done a day before the goods arrive. And then those goods, especially on live animals, will be subjected to identity and physical checks at the point of destination. So at this point in January, we're not routing those kind of goods through border inspection posts, because that's part of the kind of phasing in. So those inspections can be done at point of destination, and the goods can come into the UK via any port at this point. So picking up on another one, high priority plants and plant products, they're going to need a phytosanitary certificate. And again, they need that pre-notification and all the kind of documentary and identity and physical checks that will go with that. So that's just one subset of goods that have additional requirements. If you think about it, mostly it's about registration, pre-notification, and sometimes pre-authorization. And in the case of live animals, there are export health certificates. And in the case of priority plants and so on, there are phytosanitary certificates. So that's from the 1st of January. Again, more goods still on the 1st of January that are classed as having additional requirements. We've got excise goods. So I provided a couple of links for importing alcohol and tobacco, but essentially, you know, the checks that are in place for excise goods at the moment will continue. The only real thing to mention is that importers that want to use excise duty suspension or move their goods into a customs warehouse, for example, will either have to be registered as a consignor themselves, or they'll have to have their agent working on their behalf have that registration, if you like, to be able to ship goods from the EU into a customs warehouse in the UK. Other goods, so we've mentioned chemicals, and we've mentioned REACH. Pesticides is another good that has a specific requirement on it, so they need to receive an authorization from the Health and Safety Executive, but at this point they can come in through any point of entry, so any port in the UK. Drug precursor chemicals, drug precursors are controlled goods, so they require a registration at the National Drugs Control System, and they require an import and an export license. There are a whole host here, so I'm not going to read them through, because you'll get the actual copy of the slides. But even from the 1st of January, there's a lot of requirements in terms of registrations, pre-notification and pre-authorization that, depending on the products that you're shipping, you need to be aware of. Okay. Then as of the 1st of April, there are a couple of additional changes. And these are around predominantly export health certificates. So those products of animal origin will now be needed, in addition to live animal export certificates, which come into effect in January. Goods of animal origin will also need an export health certificate. Catch certificates we mentioned, they are needed for all fish that are coming into the UK. They need to be checked and authorised prior to landing. Those checks are carried away from the border. It's really, in terms of April, the things that are impacted are these goods subject to sanitary and phytosanitary control. So those products of animal origin and those kind of plants and plant products. So that's where we see more export health certificate requirements come into place and more documentation. Another interesting one to mention here is those goods, those food goods that could be seen to be from endangered species. So the one that gets singled out frequently is caviar from the sturgeon family. That will need to have a site certificate attached to its documentation as well. So a lot of changes afoot in April, but just on that small category of goods. And then by the 1st of January, that's it. The phasing in model is complete. Importers of all goods, irrespective of whether they're standard, controlled, or requiring additional requirements, they'll all need full declarations. Or if you've received authorization to make simplified declarations, then you can do that also. There'll be changes to the routes of goods. So as we mentioned earlier, some goods will have to go through border inspection posts, border control posts, and they'll be subject to identity and physical checks. But there's also a number of different ports around the country have different facilities, if you like. So some of them have storage capabilities, so they can store goods as they come into GB. But some ports don't, and where those ports don't, then there has to be a pre-lodgement model. So goods arriving will have to have had their customs declaration filed in advance of boarding on the EU side, and they'll be given a goods vehicle movement number. So it means that when they arrive in the UK, they're processed through quite quickly because the port doesn't have the facility to store those goods for them. We'll see import VAT levied on all goods over £135, and obviously import duty becomes payable on everything in line with the UK global tariff. The only exceptions to that are where we have any free trade agreements or there's any preferential agreements in place, like those from the GSP nations that we talked about last week. Safety and security import declarations won't have been required from January to July, but are now. So they have to, the UK customs have to have a pre-arrival information via an entry summary declaration, so that they know what's coming through and they know the goods are standard goods and can legitimately be moved on, or whether or not they need to be subjected to checks and controls and so on. And then we'll see full import controls on those goods with additional requirements. So in addition to all the stuff I've talked about, they'll now from July be routed through specific ports that have those border inspection facilities to allow them to have those identity and physical checks and samples taken in some cases. Okay, so in terms of the facilitations and simplifications, so how you can ease yourself into this as a importer, if you like, there are a number of them. I'll just pick out one. The first one that springs to mind is the simplified declaration procedure. So that allows you to, if you like, make a simplified declaration, which is backed up by a supplementary declaration later. But it allows you to ease yourself into the whole import declaration process, and also typically allows for the faster movement of goods also. Those of you in manufacturing, where you're bringing goods in from the UK and you're processing them and then re-exporting them again, something like inward processing would work really well, where your import duty and VAT is suspended while the processing or the manufacturing happens in the UK, and then it actually never becomes payable with providing you're re-exporting back out to the EU. So that's a really good one as well. Customs warehousing as well. So it allows you to bring goods in from the EU, store them, and import duty and import VAT isn't applicable until they're released into free circulation in the UK, or in another case, if they're re-exported again, then that duty and import VAT doesn't become payable. Okay, so there's a number of facilitations and simplifications that you could be looking at. Now, the couple we've talked about duty deferment accounts, we've talked about temporary storage, which is available at some approved ports. Authorised economic operator accreditation. If you are ISO 9000 registered, then you're kind of part of the way there with getting AEO status. It has a number of benefits. It's split into two parts. You can get AEO based on customs or AEO based on safety and security or supply chain. It's a bit of a kite mark but it also has some fiscal benefits as well, around up to a 70% reduction in your customs guarantee, or in some cases a waiver. But like I say, it's a kite mark, and you are expected to have tightened up your safety and security in your supply chain, so it can result in a reduction in the loss of goods or stolen goods and so on. So it's an entirely separate subject, but it's there as another simplification, if you like. So what should you be doing? We talked about a lot last week, sorry. You should all have your EORI numbers now. You need to determine whether or not you need an EU EORI number depending on your Incoterms. So like we talked about last week, as an importer, if you are trading under Ex Works, for example, whereby you're required to collect the goods from your supplier, and you make the export declaration in that local market, then you'll need an EU EORI number. Ex Works is a hideous Incoterm, and I would hope that none of you are using it, but where you need to interface with a local customs office in the EU, you will need an EU EORI number. Check your commodity codes. They are going to become crucial. They determine all of the documentation that needs to accompany a declaration. So if you've got the incorrect commodity code and your goods are inspected, whether they be physical inspections or the documentary inspections, and it's found to be wrong, then your goods will be held up, maybe even seized. And also, second to that, if you're importing under an incorrect commodity code, the chances are you could be paying more import duty or underpaying import duty and VAT, in which case, if it's the latter, then HMRC isn't going to be very happy with you. So those commodity codes are essential. Look at the Trade with the UK tool to understand all of that customs documentation and all the processes that apply to your products. Talk to your suppliers about those, see how prepared they are. Do they actually understand what they're going to need to submit to clear the goods in the UK? Look at the UK trade tariff to start doing some scenario planning around your import duty and VAT rates. Understand what your increased liability is going to be, your increased costs there. We talked a little bit last week about the customs value of goods. So the import duty and VAT that we pay on our goods when they're imported into the UK isn't always what's at face value on the commercial invoice. There are other things that go into that valuation. And in some cases, you can end up spending, 1.5, or your actual customs liability, or the amount to clear the goods in the UK can be as much as 1.5 times what's actually on the commercial invoice, depending on the trading terms that the commercial invoice is under. Take a look at those facilitations and simplified procedures, see if there's anything that you can apply for, and I've provided the link to apply for them later on the document. Decide how you're going to pay and account for goods of VAT. If you're delaying declarations, like I say, and you're VAT registered, you have to use postponed VAT accounting. But if you're not VAT registered, are you going to use your duty deferment account, for example, if you're deferring those declarations, or are you just going to settle up with HMRC as the consignment comes in? Think about a duty deferment account. Again, as I said, there's no need for a customs guarantee if that liability doesn't go above £10,000 per month. Think about your commercial arrangements with customers. So this is really getting back to the Incoterms again. What are your arrangements with customers and suppliers for the collection and delivery of goods, and do they leave you exposed to too much risk or put too much burden on you as the importer? And then, think about a customs intermediary. It's a lot to take on. If you've only ever traded within the EU, you've never had to submit import declarations, when you've dealt with the rest of the world. It's a lot to take on. There's some really good customs intermediaries that are worth their weight in gold. Appoint them, have them take this headache away from you, not forgetting that you are legally responsible for the information. So it's good to be aware of what's required, but let them handle the grunt work, if you like. So that is the we're going to nip on to exports, because I know we're probably getting quite pressed for time. In terms of exports, as I said, it is everything from the 1st of January. So you'll need to make full declarations from the 1st of January for exports, unless you're authorised to use a simplified declaration process. Groupage loads, same thing applies. It's important that you've got all of the documentation, clearance paperwork there, because you don't want to be responsible for holding up everybody else's goods. Full safety and security declarations are a requirement from the 1st of January. So you remember me saying on imports they're not actually required until the 1st of July, but for the EU wants them from the 1st of January. So by submitting a full export declaration, you are actually submitting a UK safety and security declaration. But where you're not submitting that export declaration pre-departure, you have to file an exit summary declaration. And that needs to be filed in advance of the shipment, and it really depends on the mode of transport as to how far in advance you need to file it. So, you know, by Eurotunnel it's an hour in advance, but by other methods it can be up to 72 hours. So it really depends. Again, there's facilitations and simplifications. So there is a really quite an interesting one, is the simplified transit procedures. So any of you that are moving goods through transit, where you have to have them cleared at kind of like a transit start and finish point, you can actually apply to HMRC to register your own premises as a start or end transit point, which means that the goods are, you know, come out of the transit process at your premises. So it just simplifies things enormously. Again, that's an authorization, and you know, your premises would have to meet certain criteria in order for it to be granted. Think about the national export system. So if you don't want to use a freight forwarder, if you're exclusively exporting, you're not dealing with imports, you're not dealing with valuation and import duty and so on, you might just want to make your own export declarations. And the national export system allows you to make those declarations without the need of an agent. It's quite a simple web-based tool, so you might want to take a look at that. And again, those simplified export declaration processes, because you're required from the 1st of January to make those declarations, it's a lot. If you're doing them yourselves to make full declarations, you might want to apply for simplified export declaration, which allows you to make those entries in your commercial records that I talked about before, and then submit a supplementary declaration to HMRC after that point. And again, I've given you the link for how you apply for some of these simplified procedures. I'm just going to check the time here. We are running quite short. Again, it's broken down exactly. The goods that require additional requirements are the same, pretty much the same. There's an additional 2 that I'll go on to in a second. But the EU is a little bit stricter in terms of, we've got this phasing in for imports. So for example, with export health certificates, we're not requiring those until April in some cases, January in some, but April in others. With the EU, they're requiring them from the 1st of January. So as exporters, we've got more on our plate in terms of just supplying the documentation to support the actual declaration itself. So I'll let you read through some of these at your own leisure. The other 2 that I would mention, so these don't appear in terms of imported goods, so cultural goods. So we want to kind of control this. There's several different types of control when we think about goods that we're exporting. You know, you can have outright bans where you're just not able to ship goods, right the way through to surveillance, if you like, which is where we issue licenses. So in the case of cultural goods, so those pieces of fine art and so on, we might want to restrict how many of those are exported, or we might want to make sure that if they're exported, they're coming back at some point. So in those cases, they will require a license for export out of the UK, as I say here, on whether it's a permanent or temporary basis. Other goods that are subject to controls are those strategic export controls. So they're the kind of military goods and dual use goods. And I put down here what the ramifications are of Brexit. So for example, with dual use goods, we've typically in the past been able to export those or dispatch those to the EU without the need for a license, but that will change as of the 1st of January. Any goods leaving the UK that are of dual use will require a license. So I've given you the instructions there as to how to access that license. In terms of what you should be doing, so it's a little bit similar, but just on the flip side. So obtain that EORI number. if you haven't got it already. I'd be shocked if you don't have it already, because HMRC sent out a ton of them last year. Determine whether or not you need an EU reorder number. So that is on the flip side, if you're delivering to your customers in the EU under something like deliver duty paid, well, it would be deliver duty paid, then you're responsible for interfacing with that local customs authority. So therefore, you'd need an EU reorder number. Check your commodity codes for the same reasons I mentioned earlier. You don't want to be passing the problem down the line. So you might be exporting under the wrong commodity code. You might think, oh, well, it was a mistake, you know. So what, but the fact is your customers are importing under that incorrect commodity code unless they've spotted your error, and that means that they are potentially not paying the right amount of import duty and VAT to their customs authority. Check the documentation required to clear your goods in the EU, and that is the other system that I referred to. So that's check how to export goods. It has at the moment all of the documentation there, and I know some clients that we've been working with on a one-to-one basis have been quite shocked about the documentation that they're going to have to provide and the declarations and authorizations that go with those. So check those and make sure that you're aware of what will need to accompany your goods from the 1st of January. Take a look at the national exporter system, as I mentioned, for making your own export declarations. Take a look at the facilitations and simplified procedures, especially the entry and declarants record from the 1st of January. I think that will help enormously. Think about the Incoterms, like I mentioned before. And again, I can't stress the importance of a good customs intermediary at this stage. Now, as always, I have provided a whole host of, sorry, I didn't mean to do that, a whole host of additional information and sources of support, if you like. The first page is 4 pages, but the first page is pretty much all around these different bodies that you have to register with, whether it be for export health certificates or register on the PEACH system for the movement of fruits and vegetables and so on. So some of these government bodies, if you like, you have to be registered on in order to trade from the 1st of January. So I've mentioned them kind of all in there. And then the all-important document that we've talked about today being the border operating model. So I hope that has, and I'm sorry I've kind of whistled through it, but I was just conscious of time. But I hope that's given you a flavour, and it might have even inspired you to read the actual document, which is great bedtime reading. It's only about 220 pages. It's great bedtime reading. But that's really it. If anybody has any questions, I'd be delighted to take them.
Andrea, I let you whistle through because I knew you were conscious of time. Yeah. We've had a couple of questions about whether the slides will go out, and yes, they will. Sam's been confirming that. We had one question when you were talking about importing from Alison Williamson about live cheese cultures and rennet, and the category that they would come under.
So they are products of animal origin. So they will be subject to the kind of, requirements that commodity has as of, I'm trying to think now, actually going back through what I've written. Do they need they don't need an export health certificate until April. So it's kind of, but they do need to be, you need to be making that pre-notification and potentially getting a pre-authorization from the 1st of January to import those goods. And then just check in the border operating model as to what else is required moving forward into April and July. I hope that helps. If anybody's got any questions that they want to take up with me, I'm quite happy for you just to fire me an email. That's not a problem. I've got one here. So you mentioned avoiding ex-works Incoterms on import. Would you recommend deliver duty unpaid? DDU is an old Incoterm, I believe, but moving from ex-works, if this is on import, then I would suggest moving to something like free carrier, for example, whereby the supplier is responsible for making the export declaration, and then you control the movement of goods into the UK. if going the other way, if you're operating under deliver duty paid, which requires you to interface with a local customs authority in, you know, in the destination country, then I would recommend that you look to move to delivered at place or delivered at place unloaded, which requires the customer to clear the goods for import. Where possible, you want to try and avoid navigating, you know, local customs authorities. What's the best way to find intermediary support, please? We basically buy an electronic equipment from Germany and Ireland to sell in the UK, back for repair and return to us. So if an item comes back for repair, so you buy in equipment from Germany and Ireland to sell in the UK, an item goes back for repair, you could use something like outward processing as a simplified procedure. So so that basically suspends any duty that would be due on the good being repaired on return to you. So it will be shown that you'd sent the goods back for repair in Germany, for example, and then when they came back, it would mean you wouldn't have to pay that import duty because they've been returned under that way. So no, it's not considered exporting in that way. Are there any more questions? Like I say, if anybody wants to send anything directly to me, or if I've maybe misunderstood a question that you've posed, then just drop me a line directly. When you get the copy of the slides, all of my contact details are on the last page, so feel free to fire me a question.
Well done. You got through an awful lot there. I think you could go on Mastermind with the information that you know about this.
Thank you. It's just living and breathing it, I think, at the moment. But yes, there's a lot to take in, which is why I made a decision to put it on the slides, and people can digest it in their own time.
Okay. Yes, slides will be going out. If anybody's got any other questions, please contact your local growth hubs and LEPs. Those contact details will also be on the slides. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this is number 2 of 11. And the rest of the program will also be there for you to have a look at. We started with about 40. I think we lost 1 or 2 because of school runs and things like that. So it's good that the information is going out afterwards. But I'd like to thank all the delegates that did come on board and were patient while we got things sorted out. And of course, I'd like to thank Andrea for going through that information.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, as I say, very thorough. We've got some bedtime reading. Yeah, definitely.
And I think the next session next week, I think we're doing exporting next week. So it's exporting post-EU transition. So feel free to tune into that one as well. I think it's exporting next week. Okay, well, we'll digest this all over the next week and be ready for exporting next week. That's perfect. Thank you very much, everyone. I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.